and welcome back. Well, I pulled the trigger. I am the proud owner of a brand new Ibis Ripmo 2. It's amazing. It's a beautiful bike. The lines are gorgeous. Ibis designs the most beautiful frames I've ever seen, and now I have one all to myself. I'm gonna have a lot of fun with this thing. I had to buy the NX build, and that's kind of a entry level-ish build for a bike at that level, but it actually rides well. I've only ridden it around the block a couple times with my son because I'm going to swap out the NX parts for something else later on, but this was the only way that I could get my hands on a frame. It's kind of an interesting setup because the wheels and the seat post were upgraded, and because it was kind of a special order build, that's why it was delayed and made available later in the store. Because of the COVID virus, there aren't a whole lot of these bikes available. I was calling shops all across the country and nobody had any stock. The only reason I found this one is because it was a custom build, and so it just hit the online store at my local shop. Somebody erroneously posted it online and I hit the buy button, so I ended up with it, but I had to pay a few extra bucks to get it. That being said, I am going to replace a lot of the parts with higher end versions. To start out with, I'm going to swap out the Fox DPX2 that comes with the bike with the DVO Jade. I ordered this the other day and it arrived very quickly from Southern California, and I got on the phone with the guys at DVO and they walked me through the process. So I documented the whole thing and I have it here in the video for you. I hope you enjoy it. Our local sports basement store took good care of me. I walked right in. How's it going? I ordered a bike. And they had my bike waiting for me in the back. They had just reopened after being closed for a couple of months due to COVID-19. This was their first day back. They walked me through my purchase and introduced me to my new bike. We brought it outside, took a few pictures of it, and then brought it to its new home. Let's take a look at what this bike shipped with. This large Ripmo 2 carbon frame uses the patented DW Link suspension and has 147 millimeters of rear travel and 160 millimeters up front. It comes with a Fox 36 Performance Series fork and a Fox Float DPX2 in the back. I'll be keeping the fork and replacing the rear shock, but more on that later. The bike is outfitted with SRAM NX Eagle components. That covers the shifter, the rear derailleur, the cassette, and the chain. The cranks are NX Eagle Dub. The gears range from 10 to 50 teeth. That's a great range that will allow for a lot of variety. The chainring is a stock SRAM 32 tooth, and the pedals are my old race face Chesters. It comes with SRAM Guide T brakes, and they stop the bike well. 200mm disc up front and 180mm in the rear. The bike yoke dropper post is attached to an Ibis Hi-Fi Carbon 30mm rise bar. That, in turn, is set in an Ibis stem. The Lizard Skins grips are low profile and pretty sticky. The upgraded wheels are Ibis branded. The S35 carbon rims are laced with Ibis hubs. They're quite nice and they feel light and strong. The Maxxis Assegai 2.5 tires will also likely stay on the bike after my upgrades. The WTB Chromoly Silverado saddle is pretty close to the Coda that I had planned on, so I'll try this one out instead of replacing it. And the Cane Creek headset is also of good quality and won't be replaced. Overall, it's a sturdy build, but it isn't what I wanted to build, so a lot of these parts are coming off and new ones are going on. But first, let's swap out this rear shock. The DVO Jade Coil is a remarkable device, and it comes in remarkable packaging. The parts are laid out in a pre-cut foam case sent directly from the factory. Assembling the shock is fairly straightforward. Add the spring, insert the spring clip, and turn the preload collar until it's held in place. Once it's installed, it will be ready to tune. I chose to insert a shop towel between the clevis and the seat tube. This protects the seat tube from impact when I remove the shock bolts and the rear triangle sags backwards.
I first removed the seat stay yoke bolt and the shock mount bolt. That released the shock and allowed me to remove it easily. I was careful to place my hand under the rear shock mounting position to catch the small nylon washers that love to fall and roll away. A towel on my bench vise helps protect metal items I'm working on. Removal of the bushings from the Fox shock is tricky. My shock had bushings at both ends that could be reused on the DVO shock. Older Fox shocks have different bushings that may not work. If you run into problems, call DVO during their office hours and they can probably help. I found a metal fixture that's small enough to be used on my vise as a punch to slide the tightly held bushings out of the shock eyelet. I used a basic socket to act as a receiver for the part to slide into. Make sure you size these items appropriately to avoid damage. In the vise, with one side acting as a punch and the other side acting as a receiver, I pressed the parts through the shock eyelet slowly. I was careful to make sure the parts did not slide around at all during the process. The bushing slid through partially and its nylon O-ring popped off. After removing the O-ring, I pushed the bushing the rest of the way through. It went about 90% of the way, and I was able to pop the remainder out by pulling on it. Sliding the bushing through the other shock eyelet was simple and used the same process. Once all the parts were freed, I was ready to insert them into the new shock. I placed the new shock in the vise, being careful not to let the flared body come into contact with the vise as it closed on the bushing. I don't want to get it all scratched up. I slowly pushed it into the eyelet and it held firmly. I then used a socket to hold the shock in place as I pressed the bushing the rest of the way in, centering it. It was easy to add the second O-ring and press them all together, centering the entire assembly. I repeated the same process on the other end of the shock, inserting the bushing without any O-rings. There was some residue from the eyelet material, but the fit was secure. I then used a socket to brace the shock while I carefully centered the bushing on the eyelet. Afterwards, I checked both sides of the assembly to ensure that it was perfectly centered. Reinstalling the shock was easy. I added the nylon washers to the end of the shock and held them firm with my finger. While holding them, I slid the shock into the mount on the frame and added the yoke bolt. Before tightening the yoke bolt, I raised and inserted the other end of the shock. I used Loctite on both bolts, even though I only show one here, and I inserted them, tightening them loosely using Allen wrenches. I then tightened them to their torque specification per the IBIS documentation. The shock is an improvement over its predecessor. Installation was fairly simple and worth the experience. That's how you swap a shock. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you out there on the trails.